Hey everyone, welcome back. Last time we were taking a look at jazz and the origins of jazz and how jazz musicians were able to take the pain, frustration, and brutality of systemic racism and slavery and turn it into something beautiful, and working through some of the hardships that they have endured and turn it into music by singing the blues and adding rhythm, which makes it into something beautiful and uplifting, and more importantly, empowering. The question of jazz was who controls the narrative. Today, I wanted to take a look at the Harlem Renaissance and some other cultural developments that were happening during the 1920s and 30s in the United States. The big part of the Harlem Renaissance is the mass exodus from the South into northern cities like Chicago, New York, and St. Louis, as we see with Jacob Lawrence's migration of the Negro. Um, what we see is that many people of African descent were flooding to the North seeking opportunities, economic opportunities, and educational opportunities that they would not have had in the South. And so, a couple of statistics that I present to you is 2 million people moved north in roughly a 20-year period between 1910 and 1930. In 90 days in Mississippi, 12,000 people left in that 3 month period. And then the African American population increases by 40% in many northern cities. And so there's this mass exodus to find economic opportunities, looking for the American dream. I want us to also think about what tensions that's going to create when you have 40% more of one population in an area. What kind of tensions are going to arise as a result of that? Something to consider is when we talked about the population boom of the 19th century, where we saw the increases of London, Paris, and New York, and the housing prices starting to increase, and then the job opportunities, the payment starts to go down. That these kinds of tensions are going to continue in the 1920s and 30s with this mass migration. Now, just to give you a sense, right, of their kind of hopes and dreams, what they're looking for, here's just a family that arrived in Chicago from the rural South, escaping Jim Crow laws, which we'll talk about later in the semester, escaping systemic racism, uh, looking for something better, right? Now, the issue that they're going to face is a different form of racism in the North, right? In the South, the main focus of their racism was they didn't really care how close in proximity African Americans lived to them. What they cared about is how high up in the social economic ladder African people of African descent were able to reach, and so that's where they have restrictions in education, restrictions in employment, right? The idea to try to keep them down. Now, what you see in the North is the exact inverse of that, right? In the North, they didn't really care how high socioeconomically people of African descent were able to raise. They didn't care if they were doctors, lawyers, engineers. That wasn't really their concern. What they cared about was something different. They cared about the close proximity of people of African descent in living with towards them, or living in their area. And so a different kind of racism. So you're going to see a lot more segregation laws happening in the North in terms of housing, and that's going to add another layer of the racism, because they're going to say that this is a Black community, quote unquote Black community, so only Blacks can live here, and that's going to increase the demand for housing in that area, because that's the only place they can live, and so the rent's going to be really high, and so you have the mass problems with slumlords and whatnot, right? Over 400,000 African Americans moved south in just 2 years, in 1916, 1918. So again, the pressures on housing, when half a million people moved to an area. New York became the epicenter for much of the migration. Population rose, people of African descent, from 91,700 to 152,400 in 1920. So roughly, 1 year, that's not quite double, but almost double. By 1930, there was a population of 327,000, right, in New York City. And so this is just a map of New York. When we talk about Manhattan, towards the southern tip, this is Wall Street. Chinatown, and then we get to Midtown where there is the Times Square, Central Park, the East Side, right? As we go northward, we get the East Side. That's where the old money is. The Upper West Side is used to be kind of run down, but now it's been gentrified. And then up north, this is the place where mainly African Americans lived, mainly because that was the zone. It was zoned for them, right? So this became a consolidated neighborhood of people from the South moving north looking for economic opportunities. And so there's going to be a lot of cultural developments there. What are they looking for, right? This is just a picture of people in the healing arts, right? Nurses looking for employment, things that they wouldn't have in the South when they are forced into agricultural jobs, such as sharecropping or mechanics, right? So looking for blue collar, pink collar jobs, or even white collar jobs, as we see here with working as receptionists or in the factory, another blue collar job there, but looking for employment, looking for other opportunities, right? So this is the opportunity of going to be a soldier and giving them opportunities. Now, these were still segregated units at the time, but they were able to display their patriotism. They were able to display their loyalty to the country and be able to have some more economic opportunities as well that comes with being a soldier during war. But of course, there's going to be backlash, right? And there was clearly backlash. We want white tenants in our white community, right? So there is this different type of racism that's happening in the South, and so something to be aware of. But there was more economic opportunities, and so we see that African Americans in the North were able to reach the middle and upper middle classes, and so it seemed that the American dream was now more accessible to them than it ever was, right? And so we just see these individuals looking at a nice new car with their fur coats, right? Going out on an evening on the town. And then we have the development of Apollo and Apollo Theater or Savoy Ballroom in Harlem. So these cultural hubs become a center for playing music, having concerts and whatnot for people in Harlem to be able to enjoy cultural developments. Let's take a look at some of the cultural manifestations that come out of the Harlem Renaissance, right? Some of them were music. We've talked about jazz. Some of them were literature and poems, and we'll take a look at the art. Let's take a look at Countee Cullen and his incident, right? Once riding in Old Baltimore, head filled with glee, I saw a Baltimorean keep looking straight at me. Now I was 8 and very small, and he was no whit bigger. So I smiled, but he poked out his tongue and called me the N-word, right? So that you have these two children don't really, have a lot of the political mindsets that, as often is the case with children. But even at a young age, this white child is taught that Black children are inferior and using a derogatory term to identify them. That is as if that's the only label or demarcation of identity. So it's kind of an interesting concept that Countee Cullen is exposing. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until December. Of all things that happened there, that's all that I remember, right? So it takes a lot of positive incidents to outweigh the negative ones, right? So this is clearly a negative one. Doesn't really understand why this person is seeing him differently, treating him poorly, just based on his skin color. So it stays with Countee Cullen. It kind of lingers on with his memory. But again, they're going to the North, hoping that these kinds of things don't happen, and they're still facing a different form of racism. Langston Hughes is the main writer that comes out of the Harlem Renaissance. I want to take a look at two of his poems. I Too Sing America, right? So the idea of what is an American, who has access to the American dream, who has access to the opportunities of we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, right? What does that mean, right? These are the ideals that founded this country. Who has access to them, right? So here's I Too Sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I Too Sing America, right? I too am American. So what we see here is like, what is an American, right? And as we see with some of Norman Rockwell's images that we've studied in the past, he kind of presents the typical American, right? White, middle class. And what we see with the Harlem Renaissance is they're starting to question those notions of what does that mean, right? I too am American. What is American, right? What does that what does that mean? And they're trying to expand that definition. Here's another one. The last poem I want to take a look at for Langston Hughes. This one's just entitled Harlem, right? What happens to a dream deferred, right? The idea of the American dream and what people of African descent were being told was just be patient. People are too racist now, but maybe in the future the next generation, right? The next generation, the next generation, right? And so what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Or maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode, right? So as we keep saying, everyone has access. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, have the access to the American dream, right? The idea of Frank Capra and It's a Wonderful Life, or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Who has access to the opportunities of the country? Who has a voice? Who has voting rights? Often in the South, they were restricted voting rights due to the Jim Crow laws. They were segregated. They had different water fountains and bathrooms, right? And in the North, they faced similar kinds of racism and segregation. And so, what happens to a dream deferred? When does it? When do people of African descent have full access to the American dream? Right, is the question. Right? Do we just wait, or does it explode one day? Right? Here's some paintings that come out of the Harlem Renaissance. That embodies the hopes and dreams, thinking of Langston Hughes's Harlem, of what people are looking for, right? His art embodies the dreams of freedom and equality. It underscores the hopes that are founded this country, that everyone's created equal and endowed by the Creator with unalienable rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is what makes the U.S. different, or at least at the time, or the hopes, the dreams is what we believe make it different. This is what we believe make the United States great, right? The question is whether this has been true historically. Has everyone had the same chance to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Has everyone had equality under the law? And the answer is no. But the question is whether we're moving in the right or wrong direction, right? Is the American dream for everyone? Like we saw with It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Jimmy Stewart represents the quote unquote everyman. Norman Rockwell, as I just mentioned, represents the typical American, right? Does everyone have access to this dream? Is there truly equal opportunity? That's what we see with Douglass, right? This aspiration of these individuals that are coming from slavery and bondage that we see in the foreground with their shackles and their hands raised, to the middle ground where we see scientists, engineers, teachers looking towards the city, looking towards urbanization, looking towards the economy as their way of attaining the American dream, right? Here we see the spirit of Africa. We see the question of identity. Does a Black person have to give up their heritage to achieve the ideals of the American dream? Can a person maintain parts of themselves and still be successful? Does a Black person, for instance, have to look white to be accepted in the business world, right? And that's still a question that we have to this day. Some companies have policies against people having quote unquote Black hair, such as afros or cornrows, right? And so the question is, to be able to have full access to the American dream, how much of a heritage or a certain heritage has to be denied? And if it has to be denied, are we fully accepting these people, their identity, their culture, their background, their heritage, right, et cetera, et cetera? And so the spirit of Africa is looking for, what does that mean? Do I have to deny the part of myself to be admitted into this predominantly Western European culture? Can I keep part of myself? Right? What does that mean in terms of my identity and moving forward? Right? Here we see from slavery through Reconstruction, where the idea of moving from from slavery and bondage. We can see in the kind of the middle ground the soldiers of the Civil War fighting for freedom. We see the individuals, the people of African descent that are slaves that are picking cotton in the foreground, and they're moving towards some ideal. We see an indication of the government building in the background and the city moving towards some type of better opportunity. And that's the goal, right? The goal is that we're moving in the right direction, right? Into bondage, this one is thinking about, again, about heritage and what heritage should mean, and the legacy of heritage, and how do we move forward? How do we reconcile with the past, right? So into bondage is examining that. But most of Aaron Douglas's works are going to have that kind of circular echoing element to it, as we see towards the middle, and it just kind of radiates outward. We kind of see a lot of this kind of echoing, and I think that's connecting the past to the present, as we're all kind of linked together, right? So it's kind of an interesting use of aesthetic that Aaron Douglas chooses to use for his art. I want to take a look at one more artist, Archibald J. Motley. This is what he mainly does is he does portraits, trying to humanize people of African descent to show how similar we all are. There are cultural differences, sure, but we all have the same hope, the same aspirations. We all have families. We all want the best for our families. We all want educational and economic opportunities, right? So this is a portrait of his grandmother, showing her just against the wall, showing who she is, right? And just kind of in a very plain, honest, natural sort of way to humanize them in a manner comparable to Dorothea Lange and her photography project as she goes throughout the Midwest and into California, uh, taking portraits of people during the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, right? Or this one is the Octoroon girl, again trying to humanize people. This individual, the name Octoroon means that she has 1/8 African blood in her, right? So they have to kind of go back several generations to find that there is someone of African descent in her bloodline, and because there's there's 1/8 of her being African descent, she's considered black. And so again, the question that Motley is suggesting, very similar to what we see with Douglas, is the idea of identity. What does that even mean, right? Who cares, right? It's one way to look at it. Like one drop of black blood makes someone entirely black. What does that even mean? Or the other side of that too is, why do we have to deny part of our heritage, right? So there's some complexities in terms of our identity and what the cultural heritage, the weight, the gravitas that sometimes society places too much on, rather than allowing people to just be themselves, find their own individuality. Society places these restrictions, these parameters on just based on their own arbitrary definitions, right? And then what Motley also does is he represents this Harlem Renaissance culture, right? There's rising Black culture happening in the North and their access to the American dream. And so he shows them here at cocktails. So the rising upper middle class that's happening, they're able to have these economic opportunities that they weren't able to have before, or the clubs that start forming with jazz, right? So this is the Jockey Club. So these new kind of excitement that they're able to have their own expression, their own means of expression, their own means of art. See that with the jazz singers. So again, connecting this with our previous lecture on jazz, that this is something to celebrate. This is something that's exciting, right? New kind of times, new opportunities. And so it feels like they're able to access, even if it's a small part of the American dream, they're able to access part of the American dream. And so he's celebrating that point. And the lawn party, similar ideas. Lawn party, similar ideas that we see with that, where they're able to rise to the upper middle class and have a little bit of leisure, right? Have a little bit of access to what white wealthy are able to have access to, right? Nightlife, similar ideas with the jazz clubs, people singing, going out at night, enjoying themselves, right? Or the barbecue, similar kind of ideas, right? So this is the Harlem Renaissance, looking for a new identity, some of the cultural changes and how that's creating excitement. So we see similar connecting this to our discussion of the Great Depression and the emergence of the common man, we see another element of this, looking for other individuals rather than just wealthy white men as a way to celebrate people of industry, the titans of industry that are the pioneers of civilization. This is more looking at different cultures and finding value within them. And so this is another trend that's happening during the 1920s and 30s.